The morning Francesca Hawthorne rode into Teller's Creek, the sky was the color of the old bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, dark at the center. She came in on a wagon that wasn't hers, sitting beside a driver who hadn't spoken 10 words the entire stretch from Dunmore. And when the wheel cracked against the rut at the edge of Main Street and the whole left side of the wagon lurched sideways, she didn't scream. She grabbed the seatboard with both hands and held on. That was the first thing Everett Cobb noticed about her. Not her face, not the trunk strapped to the wagon bed. The fact that she didn't scream. He was leaning against the post outside Renner's Feed and Goods when it happened, arms crossed, watching the street the way he always did, not because he was curious about people, again, but because watching was a habit built from years of having no one to talk to. He saw the wagon lean. He saw the driver fumble uselessly with the reins, and he saw the woman hold on. He didn't move to help. Not yet. The driver, a thin man named Pruitt, who ran occasional freight between Dunmore and Teller's Creek, climbed down from the tilted wagon with an expression caught somewhere between embarrassed and relieved. The wheel hadn't fully broken, just cracked along the inner rim, enough to make the axle sit wrong. Pruitt circled it twice, crouched, stood back up, and announced to no one in particular that he'd be needing a smith. Francesca climbed down on her own. She was younger than Everett had expected, late 20s, or maybe 30, with dark hair pinned back under a travel-worn hat, and a dress that had once been a deep green, but had faded somewhere along too many miles of dust. She looked at the wheel, then at Pruitt, then at the street around her with the careful, measuring expression of someone who had learned not to expect help, but was quietly calculating where it might come from anyway. Teller's Creek had a blacksmith. It had a general store, a post office, a church that doubled as a courthouse when Judge Alderman came through, 2 saloons, and approximately 340 people, most of whom had already formed an opinion about everyone else within a 5-mile radius. It was the kind of town where news traveled faster than horses, and a woman arriving alone on a damaged freight wagon would be known, discussed, and quietly judged before she'd even unpacked. Everett pushed off the post and walked back inside Renner's. He heard about her again 2 hours later. May Renner mentioned her while sorting boot nails behind the counter. Said the Hawthorne woman was asking about the Alderman boarding house. Said she had luggage and a name, but no explanation. Said she'd paid for 3 weeks up front in clean bills and hadn't smiled once doing it. Everett said nothing. He paid for his flour and his tobacco and left. He had a small place 2 miles east of town. Not a ranch exactly, more a working property with a barn, a garden plot, a well, and a house that had exactly as much inside it as one man needed, and nothing more. No curtains, no photographs. A table with 2 chairs, though he'd never had reason to use the second one. He'd built the place himself, the same way he'd built everything in his life, alone, without instruction, learning the cost of every mistake as he made it. He'd come to Teller's Creek 11 years ago with $40, a saddle, and a last name that meant nothing to anyone in the territory. That suited him fine. A name that meant nothing, owed nothing. He didn't think about Francesca Hawthorne again until 3 days later, when he found her standing at the edge of his property line. She wasn't trespassing, not technically. She was standing just beyond the fence, looking at his east field with an expression that wasn't wonder and wasn't hunger, but something quieter than both. Like recognition, almost. Like she'd seen land worked alone before and knew exactly what it looked like. While Everett came out from the barn with a length of rope in his hand and stopped when he saw her. She turned when she heard his boots on the dry ground. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said immediately. Not apologetically, matter-of-factly, as if she'd learned that leading with that sentence saved time. "Then keep walking," Everett said. She didn't keep walking. She looked at him with those careful, measuring eyes and said, "Someone broke into my room at the boarding house last night. Went through my trunk. I don't know this town well enough to know who to tell and who not to tell. The man at the livery said you'd lived here longer than most." Everett looked at her for a long moment, the rope in his hand, the sky behind her going pale with late morning heat. The way she stood, straight, still, and not performing distress, but not hiding it either. "Alderman's the law when he's in town," he said. "He's not in town. I know that. Deputy Foss drinks. I noticed that too." He should have pointed her toward someone else. May Renner, maybe, who knew everyone's business and genuinely liked solving problems. Or Hatch Sorensen, who ran the second saloon and had an unofficial arrangement with the town council about keeping order. There were people in Teller's Creek equipped for this kind of thing. Everett was not one of them. "What was taken?" he asked, against his better judgment. Francesca's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to tell him the answer mattered more than she was going to let on. "Papers," she said. "Legal documents. And a letter." "What kind of legal documents?" She looked at him steadily. "The kind that proves something belongs to me." He didn't invite her in. He didn't offer water, though the day was already hot enough to make the air above the road shimmer. He stood at his fence and listened to the rest of what she told him. That she'd come to Teller's Creek because her late father had owned a parcel of land on the south edge of town. That the land had been in dispute since his death 14 months ago. That someone in Teller's Creek had apparently known she was coming before she arrived. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that most people would have filled the silence. She didn't. "I'll ask around," he said finally. Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly. More like she'd been holding her breath for 3 days and had just now allowed herself to exhale a fraction. "I'm not asking for more than that," she said. "Good," Everett said, "because that's all I'm offering." He turned and walked back toward the barn. He didn't look back. He never looked back. It was a discipline he'd developed early and kept carefully, because looking back had a way of making a man responsible for things he hadn't agreed to carry. But he heard her footsteps moving away down the road, and for a reason he didn't examine, he found himself listening until he couldn't hear them anymore. That night, sitting at his table with the single lamp burning low and the windows dark, Everett Cobb thought about what she'd said. "The kind that proves something belongs to me." He knew what it was to fight for something no one believed was yours. He knew what it was to have nothing written down, no proof, and no one standing beside you when the question came up. He'd lived the first 18 years of his life without a single document that confirmed he existed. No birth record, no family name that held, nothing but his own word and his own 2 hands. He hadn't planned to get involved in Francesca Hawthorne's trouble. He'd told himself he was only listening to be neighborly, which was already more than he usually managed. But the papers had been taken from a locked trunk, in a locked room, in a boarding house where only May Renner held the spare keys. And Francesca had said someone in Teller's Creek had known she was coming before she arrived. Everett set down his coffee cup and stared at the lamp flame for a while. Then he reached across the table and pulled the second chair out slightly, not for any reason, just a movement, or just a small thing, and sat with the uncomfortable feeling that this town and this woman's trouble had just become harder to walk away from than he'd intended. Everett was at May Renner's store by the time the morning light was still thin and gray. May herself was already behind the counter, which surprised no one who knew her. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s, who had outlasted 2 husbands, a fire that took half the store in 1877, and every attempt the town council had ever made to raise her rent. She looked up when Everett came in and read his expression the way she read most things, quickly and without comment. "You're here early," she said. "Who has keys to the boarding house rooms?" Everett said. Not a question, a direction. May set down the bolt of cloth she was measuring. "Good morning to you too, Everett." May. She looked at him for a moment, then looked at the door behind him as if checking who might be listening. The store was empty. She came around the counter slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, and lowered her voice, even though there was no one to lower it for. "I have a spare for each room," she said. "That's it. I keep them on a ring in the back office, locked box, and I am the only one with that key." "You're certain?" "I have been running that boarding house for 16 years, Everett Cobb. I am certain." He nodded slowly. "Did anyone come to you before Francesca Hawthorne arrived? Asking about rooms, asking about who was expected?" May's expression shifted. Not guilt, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person who had answered a question without knowing it was a question. Harlan Greer came in about 10 days ago," she said carefully. "Asked if I had any rooms going for the next month. Said he was expecting a business associate from out of territory." "Harlan Greer," Everett repeated. "He didn't take a room. Said he'd circle back." May folded her arms. "He never did." Harlan Greer was not a man Everett had ever liked, which was notable only because Everett had no particular feeling about most people one way or another. Greer ran a land and title office on the north end of Main Street, a business that had appeared in Teller's Creek about 4 years ago, with just enough paperwork to look legitimate and just enough money behind it to make the town council stop asking questions. He was polished in a way that frontier towns tended to distrust on instinct, shot with city-bought clothes, and a handshake that lasted precisely as long as it needed to, and not 1 second more. Everett had done exactly one transaction with him, a boundary survey on his east field 3 years back, and had walked away with the feeling that Greer had been measuring something other than land the entire time. He didn't go to Greer's office that morning. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and a man who walked into a conversation before he was ready tended to show exactly what he knew and learn nothing in return. Instead, he went to find Francesca. She was at the edge of the empty lot behind the church, of all places, standing in the knee-high dry grass with her arms at her sides, looking south. The direction, Everett knew, of the Hawthorne parcel. He stopped a few feet away, but she heard him coming, but didn't turn immediately, which told him she'd already learned the sound of his boots on dry ground. That bothered him slightly more than it should have. "You know where your father's land is from here," he said. "I've known since the first morning," she said. "I walked the boundary the day after I arrived, before someone got into my trunk." Was the boundary marked? Stakes and wire on 3 sides. The 4th side, the creek side. Someone pulled the stakes. She finally turned to look at him. Recently, the ground was still soft where they'd been. Everett absorbed that. Pulled stakes meant someone wanted the boundary in question, wanted it uncertain, which meant the dispute over the Hawthorne parcel wasn't waiting for lawyers and judges. Someone in Teller's Creek was already working against her, and they'd started before she'd even arrived. "Tell me about the documents that were taken," he said. Francesca was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, choosing, deciding how much to hand to a man she'd known less than a week. "My father's will," she said, "and the original land grant, registered in Dunmore in 1871, and a letter he wrote me 3 months before he died, explaining why he never told me about the land while he was alive. Why didn't he?" Something moved through her eyes, old and complicated, the kind of pain that had been handled so many times It no longer broke the surface, but was always there underneath. Because he was ashamed, she said simply. He left this town when I was 4 years old. Left something behind here that he spent the rest of his life trying to make right. Yet the land was his way of making it right after he was gone. Everett didn't ask what he'd left behind. It wasn't his business. And more than that, he recognized the particular exhaustion in her voice of someone who had been asked to explain a wound too many times. The letter, he said instead. Why would someone want the letter? Francesca looked at him steadily. Because the letter names someone. She didn't tell him the name. Not yet. And he didn't push for it, which seemed to surprise her. He saw it in the brief shift of her expression, the slight recalibration, like she'd been bracing for pressure and had leaned into nothing. They walked back toward the main street, without quite deciding to walk together. It happened the way things happened between two careful people, gradually, without announcement, each pretending not to notice. People are talking about me, she said. Not upset by it, just noting it. People here talk about everything, Everett said. Don't take it as particular interest. What are they saying? He considered lying. Decided against it. She didn't seem like someone who benefited from softened truth. That you're here for land that isn't yours. That your father left bad debts behind. That you've got city ideas about frontier property law. Francesca absorbed this without flinching. And what do you think? I think someone went to considerable trouble to make sure the town was already against you before you got here. She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before he realized it, and turned. And for a moment, they just looked at each other in the middle of the dusty street, with the morning coming up full and hot around them. Well, why are you helping me? She asked. Not suspiciously. Genuinely. Like the answer mattered. Everett had asked himself the same question 3 times in the past 24 hours, and had not arrived at a satisfying answer any of those times. He settled on the one that was true, without being the whole truth. Because someone in this town is lying, he said. And I don't tolerate that well. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she nodded once and started walking again. The trouble came 2 days later, and it came in the form of a man named Dylan Pierce. Pierce was Harlan Greer's associate, not employed exactly, not in any way that could be written down, but present whenever Greer needed something handled that couldn't be handled in a land office. When he was large in the way that men are large when they've spent years using it, and he had eyes that moved around a room before his body did. Everett came into town that afternoon to find Pierce standing outside the boarding house with 2 other men, and Francesca standing in the doorway, and the conversation between them already at the temperature, where words were just sounds before the real thing started. He didn't run. He walked, steadily, directly, the way he did everything, until he was standing close enough that Pierce had to choose between acknowledging him and pretending not to see him. Pierce chose acknowledgement. Cobb, he said. Flat. Territorial. Pierce, Everett said. You standing on May Renner's property for a reason, or you're just enjoying the shade. Having a conversation. Doesn't look like a conversation. Everett looked at Francesca briefly. She was steady, chin up, but her right hand was pressed flat against the doorframe, the kind of grip that kept things from shaking. He looked back at Pierce. Looks like 3 men trying to make 1 woman uncomfortable on her own doorstep. Her own doorstep. Pierce smiled, the kind that had no warmth in it anywhere. Funny thing about that, this town's got a lot of questions about what's hers and what isn't. Then those questions can go through proper channels, Everett said, when Judge Alderman comes through next week. Maybe some things can't wait for Alderman. The street had gone quiet around them, not empty, but quiet. The particular quiet of a town watching. It's the kind of audience that would either remember this moment or forget it, depending entirely on how it ended. Everett took one step forward. Just one. Measured. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "we've found out what kind of men we're dealing with." The moment held for a long count. Then Pierce looked at the two men beside him, looked back at Everett, and made the calculation that men like Pierce always made, not out of fear, but out of timing. This wasn't the moment. He knew it. Everett knew it. The whole quiet street knew it. Pierce turned and walked away. The two men followed. Francesca exhaled slowly. She looked at Everett, and he saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Not gratitude exactly, but something more unsettling than gratitude. Recognition. The way a person looks at someone when they see something familiar in them. It's something they've been looking for, without knowing they were looking. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. He started to turn away. His instinct, his default. The movement he made at the end of every interaction to signal that it was over, that he was done, that no one should expect more from him than what had just been given. "Everett." He stopped. She almost never used his name. He realized in that moment he could count on one hand the times she had. "I'll tell you the name," she said. "The name in the letter. I think you've earned it." He turned back. She was still standing in the doorway, the afternoon light falling at an angle across her face. And she looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been carrying something alone for too long and are just now considering the possibility of setting it down. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He stood there for a moment. That familiar pull in two directions, the one that always won, and the one that never quite stopped trying. Then Everett Cobb walked through the door. The coffee was strong, and the room was small, and Everett sat in the chair nearest the door, a habit so ingrained he didn't notice it anymore, always close to the exit, always positioned to leave. Francesca noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She poured 2 cups and sat across from him at the narrow table by the window, where the afternoon light came through the thin curtain in long, pale strips. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at it for a moment before she spoke. "The name in the letter," she said, "is Harlan Greer." Everett said nothing. He waited. "My father and Greer were partners once, before I was born, before my father left Teller's Creek. They had filed jointly on that land parcel. Equal shares, registered in both names." She paused. "When my father left, Greer told the county office he had bought my father's share outright. He had a document to prove it. But your father said otherwise. My father said he never sold, said he left in a hurry and left things unresolved and spent 14 years telling himself he'd come back and fix it." Her jaw tightened slightly. "He never came back, but he kept his copy of the original joint grant, and he wrote me that letter so I would know the truth of it when he was gone. And now both the grant and the letter are missing." "Yes." Everett turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Greer's had 4 years to build himself into this town. He's got the council comfortable with him. He's got Pierce for anything that can't be done in daylight." He looked up at her. "Going against that with nothing in your hands is going to be difficult. I know that. Judge Alderman is fair," he said. "But fair doesn't mean easy. And without the documents—" "I have one document," Francesca said. He went still. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She was still wearing it, had been wearing it since she came downstairs, and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. It was old, the creases worn soft, and the edges slightly brown. "My father sent me this 2 months before he died," she said. "Separately from everything else. I didn't understand why he sent it separately until the night someone went through my trunk. She met Everett's eyes. He knew someone might come for the rest, so he made sure this one traveled a different road. Everett reached across the table and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter. Not the one she'd described, not the long explanation of her father's history, but something shorter. A single page in a careful hand, dated, witnessed by a notary, stamp out of a town called Ferris Crossing. A sworn statement, attesting to the existence of the original joint land grant, attesting that no sale had ever taken place, while signed by Francis Hawthorne and countersigned by 2 witnesses whose names Everett didn't recognize, but whose notary stamps were clear and dated. He read it twice. Then he set it down carefully on the table between them. "This is enough," he said. Francesca let out a breath so quietly it was almost nothing. "I needed someone who knew this town to tell me that," she said. "I needed to be sure I wasn't holding a piece of paper and telling myself it was more than it was." "It's enough," he said again. "Alderman gets here Thursday." The next 3 days were the longest Everett could remember in recent years, and that was saying something for a man who had spent considerable portions of his life in his own company, with nothing but work and silence for company. He found himself in town more than usual, and found himself walking past the boarding house at hours he had no particular reason to be walking past it. Found himself in conversation with people he normally passed with a nod, listening for anything that moved the way rumors moved when someone was directing them, shaped and aimed rather than simply spreading. Greer was quiet. That bothered Everett more than noise would have. Pierce had not come back to the boarding house, but Everett had seen him twice in the street, both times watching, both times looking away without acknowledgement the moment Everett's eyes found him. A man doing calculations, a man waiting for the right moment in the same way Everett was. On Tuesday evening, Francesca came out to his property. He saw her coming up the road from the window and stood at the kitchen table for a moment doing nothing, that which was not something he did often. Then he went to the door and opened it before she knocked. She looked at him with a faint expression of something, amusement, maybe, or something quieter than amusement. "You saw me coming," she said. "Rode straight," he said. "Hard to miss." She had a cloth-wrapped parcel in her hands. She held it out. "I cooked too much," she said simply. He looked at the parcel. He looked at her. He stepped back from the door and let her in. She had never been inside his house before. He was aware of it in a way he couldn't entirely account for. Aware of the bare walls, the 2 chairs, the single lamp, the complete absence of any evidence that warmth had ever been allowed to settle here. And he watched her take it in without taking it in, the careful way she moved her eyes around the room without making it a survey, without making him feel examined. She set the parcel on the table and unwrapped it. Bread and beans and a cut of beef she'd cooked with something that smelled like rosemary, which was not something that had ever been present in his kitchen. "Sit down," she said, with the tone of a woman who had decided that something was going to happen and was no longer asking permission for it. He sat down. They ate mostly in silence, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. Everett had eaten alone at this table so many thousands of times that the presence of another person should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, it felt like the silence had a different quality, fuller somehow, or less like absence and more like rest. "You built this place yourself," she said at one point. Not a question. "Yes." "How long did it take?" 2 years for the house. Another year for the barn to be right. She looked at the walls. "You never added anything." "Didn't need to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, like a person stepping onto uncertain ground and testing the weight before committing. Did you ever want to? Everett set his fork down. He looked across the table at her, and she looked back at him with those steady, honest eyes that never seemed to ask for more than the truth and never seemed to flinch when they got it. I didn't know how to want things like that, he said. For a long time. She nodded slowly. My father was the same way, she said. He built a perfectly sufficient life and kept it perfectly sufficient because he didn't believe he deserved more. She looked down at her cup. I spent a long time being angry at him for that. Then I spent a long time understanding it. And now I think sufficiency is a kind of hiding, she said quietly. And hiding is exhausting. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the night had come down full, and the crickets were loud in the dry grass, and somewhere far off, a coyote said something to the dark that the dark didn't answer. Everett looked at the table, at the two plates where there had always been one, at the second chair that had always been pulled slightly out for no reason he'd ever examined. Thursday came. Judge Alderman arrived on the noon stage, a tall, deliberate man in his 60s with a white beard and the particular patience of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He set up in the church by 2 o'clock, and by 3 o'clock Harlan Greer was sitting on one side of the room and Francesca Hawthorne was sitting on the other, and Everett was standing along the back wall because he was not a party to any of it, and had told himself that 3 times on the walk over. Greer had a lawyer with him, a young man from Dunmore, who spoke quickly, and arranged papers on his table with the confidence of someone who had been told he was holding a winning hand. Francesca had the sworn statement, and she had Everett, who stood along the back wall and was not a party to any of it. Greer's lawyer presented the bill of sale, the document Greer had filed 4 years ago, claiming purchase of Frances Hawthorne's share. It was clean and dated and looked entirely legitimate. Francesca presented the sworn statement. The notary stamps, the dates. Alderman read both documents for a long time. The room was very quiet. Greer sat with his hands folded on the table, and his expression arranged in the particular stillness of a man who was good at waiting, but was finding this wait harder than expected. Then Alderman looked up and asked Greer a single question. He asked him to produce the record of payment, the bank record, the receipt, any evidence of money having changed hands for the purchase he claimed. Greer's lawyer shuffled papers. He shuffled them again. The room waited. There was no payment record, but that there had never been a payment because there had never been a sale, and Harlan Greer had spent 4 years counting on the fact that Frances Hawthorne was either too ashamed or too far away to ever come back and say so. He hadn't counted on a daughter. Alderman ruled within the hour. The land belonged to Francesca Hawthorne, sole and clear title, registered immediately. Greer was instructed to appear before a full court in Dunmore within 30 days to answer questions about the fraudulent filing. Pierce left town the following morning before sunrise, which was answer enough to questions no one had officially asked yet. Teller's Creek absorbed it all. The way tight communities absorbed things, loudly, immediately, and with the collective energy of people who had suspected something was wrong for years and were relieved to be proven right. Everett found Francesca outside the church afterward, standing in the same careful, still way she always stood when she was feeling something large and had decided to feel it privately. He stopped beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. "It's over," she said finally. "The legal part," he said. She looked at him. "What part isn't over?" He'd been asking himself the same question for 3 days. He'd been standing in his house in the evenings looking at 2 chairs and 1 lamp and walls with nothing on them, and asking himself what it was exactly that he was waiting for, what he was afraid of, yet whether the thing he was afraid of was actually danger or whether it was something else entirely, the unfamiliar shape of something he wanted. "I don't know how to do this," he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly without decoration, because he'd never learned the habit of dressing things up and had stopped apologizing for it. Francesca looked at him steadily. "Do what?" "Any of it." He kept his eyes forward. "I've been alone a long time, long enough that I don't know what I look like when I'm not. I don't know if I'm capable of—" He stopped, tried again. "I've pushed every person away who ever got close enough to matter, not because I wanted to, because I didn't know what else to do with them." The afternoon was very still. A wagon passed on the far end of the street, and the sound of it faded, and then there was just the quiet and her presence beside him. "I know," Francesca said gently. "I've been watching you try to push me away for 2 weeks." He looked at her then. "You told me to keep walking that first day," she said. "You walked away from me at the fence. You turned away after Pierce left. Every time you helped me, you turned around immediately afterwards so it couldn't become something." She tilted her head slightly. "I didn't take it personally. I recognized it. Recognized it. My father did the same thing to everyone he loved." She held his gaze. "It wasn't cruelty. It was fear. And the difference between the two is important." Everett looked at her for a long time. At the honesty in her face, the steadiness, the absolute absence of performance, which she wasn't telling him he was good. She wasn't telling him she could fix him. She was just telling him she saw him, the actual shape of him, all of it, and was still standing there. That was the thing he hadn't known how to believe was possible. "I don't know that I'll be easy," he said quietly. "I'm not looking for easy," she said. "I've had easy. Easy left." She paused. "I'm looking for real." He didn't say anything else. He wasn't made for the kinds of speeches that moments like this seemed to call for. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and took her hand. She didn't step back. They stood like that for a while, side by side in the afternoon light, just while Teller's Creek moved around them, and the world continued its business, and two people who had both spent too long alone stood in the quiet and let something begin. It didn't happen quickly. Real things rarely do. Francesca kept the land and broke ground on it in the spring. A small house first, practical and solid, the way she did everything. Everett came to help with the framing on a Saturday in March, and stayed through the week without either of them discussing whether he would. The second Saturday, he brought lumber. The third Saturday, he didn't leave at all. By summer, the house had curtains. By fall, it had a garden. By the following spring, it had a cradle in the corner of the bedroom, built by hand from cedar wood, a sanded smooth and fitted perfectly, the work of a man who had finally learned that building something for someone else was not a loss. Their son was born on a Thursday, which was the same day Judge Alderman had ruled the land hers, and Francesca said that was fitting. Everett held the boy for a long time without speaking, the way he held most things that mattered, carefully, quietly, with his whole attention. He looked across the room at Francesca, who was watching him with tired eyes and the expression that had no name in any language he knew. She reached out her hand, and he crossed the room and took it. Outside, Teller's Creek went about its business. The railroad ran its lines another 40 miles west. The old ways kept meeting the new ones. The land stayed. And in a cedar-framed house on the south edge of town, a man who had spent his whole life not knowing how to be loved sat beside the woman who had stayed anyway, and finally, slowly, imperfectly, completely, learned.